Could you tell us what you are going to talk about, what you want to tell?
I was asked in the first place to paint a broad picture of what was going on in the populations of Europe as a sort of context for the remarks of other people on migration. What I thought I would talk about are various challenges confronting Europe and other developed populations in the 21st century. These include the continued low birth rate, which in some European countries is generating quite severe levels of population aging and has already moved some of them into a state of population decline. Other parts of Europe, northwestern Europe, France, Britain, Scandinavia, Ireland, do not have quite the same low fertility, that their birth rate remains robust. They will suffer rather fewer problems of population aging. But all countries where the birth rate has started to decline are aging. This is an absolutely inescapable change of varying degrees of severity. And one of the points I want to emphasize is this is unavoidable. It is a consequence of acquiring the highly desirable characteristics of low birth rates and low death rates, reflecting the way in which people have achieved control over their lives in a way which was never possible in the past. This is an undoubted advantage and benefit, but it brings with it the penalty of population aging. I believe that population aging, as long as birth rates remain reasonably high, can be managed by sensible, rational, wise, long-term decisions on retirement age, on workforce participation, on the reform of pensions, and other things which are well within our capacity to do. And I think that some of the more gloomy forecasts of disaster arising out of population aging assume that no precautions of any kind, no management will be made at all, and this is foolish and I think unreasonable. I'm also going to talk about migration, the way in which migration into Europe has arisen, what its consequences might be, and the way in which, while this can benefit the process of population aging, higher migration can moderate aging, it can't solve it any more than high birth rates can solve it in the strict sense of the word solve. And migration, depending on where it comes from and depending on how it is handled, can bring quite serious problems. In some countries, in Europe, the number of immigrants per year is the same as the number of births. This means that there is rapid ethnic change going on in some countries which we are ill-equipped to cope with and which is not, obviously, in my view, desirable. And that is one of the big challenges, which is difficult to surmount because of the way in which there are powerful pressures from poorer countries to move into Europe for obvious reasons, and also because European countries have all agreed to very wide-ranging undertakings on family unification, human rights and so on, with very big implications for their control or lack of control over migration flows. I think possibly if they'd realised what the consequences would have been of these agreements, they might well not have agreed so readily to have implemented them. Let me start by looking at the broadest possible canvas and then narrowing down onto some specific European problems. Much of what I will say will relate to the future as the programme requires. It's very important to realise that the diagrams and graphs which I will show, which show very firm lines pointing very clearly into the future, are always all going to be wrong. What I suggest we keep in mind, though, is that it matters how wrong they are going to be. And there are certain regularities in demographic behaviour which are denied to our economic colleagues, which enable us to put some confidence on the future, at least in the medium term, even if the precise details of what we say will happen are certain not to happen. I've listed some good bets for the future on which I would put a lot of money. I will not read them out, but we know about the extra 3 or 4 billion that are promised. We know that almost all of those will live in cities. We know that almost all birth rates will stay low, and populations are therefore almost all getting older. And also because of migration, Europe will become less European. Can I perhaps just remind us, though, that contrary to what you read in the newspapers, this is not just the century of population aging, it is also a century of population growth, and this population growth is happening in the least in the poorest and the most economically and environmentally fragile countries in the world. It is very difficult for journalists to get into their mind that we can face two problems at once, both aging and rapid growth. But that is what's happening, and that will characterize our century and drive these divergences in population size. Other things we don't know at all. I will not mention global climate change because we simply do not know exactly what the effect will be on population. I think they will be severe. I think the effect of global climate change will disrupt, in the longer term, quite a few of the projections that I will present to you. But I do not know to what extent, so I will remain silent on that, just with that warning. Secondly, we don't know why anyone bothers to have any children when they live in an educated society with access to family planning. Think of the trouble and expense. Think of the £400,000 opportunity cost it costs. Think of the 20 years of partial house arrest. It is surely if we told people in advance about these things, they would not trouble to have children. Likewise, at the moment, death rates are going down in the developed world in a linear fashion. Expectation of life is increasing in a linear fashion. We don't know where this is going to stop. There must be a limit somewhere, but so far it is nowhere in sight. This is the standard world population projection by the United Nations. The blue line is their favored one because demographers always wisely hedge their bets. You will see a red line above, which is in case birth rates do not decline as fast as supposed. The green line below, very interestingly, is if birth rates do decline faster than expected, and the world population slips into decline before the end of the century. According to my colleagues at the Vienna Institute of Demography, just across the road from Prague, as it were, there is a 70 or 80% probability that overall world population will be in decline by the end of the century, starting around 2070 or so. That's the thin red line in the middle. This is a different kind of projection, the details of which, alas, there's no time to go into. But within all this overall population change, there are huge divergences. The blue line here, still pointing up to the stratosphere, is the projected population growth of sub-Saharan Africa. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Okay. I promise not to move anymore. The future is, to a very considerable extent, African, according to this projection. That takes the African population up to about 3.5 billion, which would be about a third of the projected total population of the world or more. The green line below is that of China, that of India, projected to be in decline before the end of the century. The red line below is of China, almost certain to be in decline within 30 years' time. And below that, you can see the United States, you can see various other countries, and including Europe. Europe is the blue line with the vertical hatches, more or less not changing much, but declining slowly. And this illustrates my point about the relative marginalization of Europe on the world stage. It seems to me that there is no such thing as Europe when talking about demographic change. Our friends across the Atlantic regard Europe, not unreasonably, as an entity. They find it tiresome, as many of us do, to think of the 40 or so different countries and remember their names and what they are and what they're like. Europe is therefore a package. In fact, Europe is highly diverse, pointing in different directions, different birth rates, different patterns of marriage formation. If you start to unpack Europe, you find that all sorts of interesting and important divergences are taking place. Here we see the purple line pointing upwards, the United States growing very rapidly as it gobbles up large parts of the population of Latin America, as well as with its own quite high birth rate. The main reason why overall European populations are often regarded as being in decline is because of the low birth rates in Eastern Europe and the projected population decline in Eastern Europe, already a reality in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Bulgaria, and a number of other countries, possibly with more to follow. That is the blue line which points downwards at the top. Down at the bottom, in red, is northwestern Europe, Britain, Scandinavia, France, and others, increasing quite a lot, thank you very much, possibly, according to some, in England anyway, rather too much. So considerable differences in destiny appear to await different regions of Europe if these projections are correct. And if we look a little bit closer, enlarge the magnification a little bit, then we see other changes taking place. The red line on top is the projection of Germany. Germany, which tipped into population decline a few years ago and is projected to go on declining. The population of Germans, of course, has been declining for 30 or 40 years. But this is the total population of the residents of Germany, whether German or not. Below that, in blue and purple, we see France and Britain fighting it out, as it were, to be Europe's top dog demographically, with the British population exceeding that of Germany by 2050. 2050, according to this graph. I don't think this will happen. I hope it will not happen, but this is what the United Nations thinks is going to happen, according to its most recent projections. And below then, you see Italy in decline and Spain behaving rather strangely because it suddenly decided to incorporate about 1 million illegal immigrants, which therefore made a very big difference overnight to the population projection. Looking even more in detail, here is Central and Eastern Europe. The Czech Republic here is in red with the vertical hatching, and as you can see, it is almost the only country in Eastern Europe which is more or less holding its own in terms of population, where the population is projected not to decline, but to remain at about the same level as it is now. Almost all others are scheduled to decline. We have here Poland at the top and at the bottom Bulgaria and one or two other countries where population decline is already well underway. The basic driver of these differences is and has been the birth rate. This indicator here is commonly called the birth rate or the fertility rate. Technically and boringly, it's called the total fertility rate. It is the number of babies that the average woman would have if she went through life experiencing the birth rates at each age which exist in any country at any particular point in time. Sorry, that is very long-winded. But when you read in the paper about the birth rate in Niger being 7, that in France being 2, what they mean is the total fertility rate. Like Molière's Bourgeois Gentilhomme, they're talking total fertility rate without knowing it. It is a what-if calculation of some complexity, but it's the best that we've got. Anyway, at the top here in orange at the end you see the United States. Below that you see Northern Europe doing quite nicely. No one expects the birth rate will ever go above 2, by the way. So that's about as high as you can possibly get. Right down at the bottom you have in pale blue the former Soviet Union and in red the Southern Europe and in deep blue Central and Eastern European, which of course we find the Czech Republic right down at the bottom. All increasing, by the way. Depressing newspaper headlines about Europe's declining birth rate are nonsense. They have been nonsense for some years. In Western and Northern Europe, they've been nonsense for 30 years. Those birth rates are creeping up, not down, as you can see from this graph here, which I selected to make my point for me, but nonetheless, the data are real. Back in Central and Eastern Europe, if we look at more detail, you can see the turmoil of the communist period where the birth rate was tweaked. It was regarded as something to be managed, like tractor production. A little bit more abortion here, a little bit less abortion there, and you can see the unevenness which generated, as you all well know, I'm sure, a rapid decline after the end of communism and a recovery in recent years. What it will recover to remains to be seen. Important to realize that things aren't as bad as they seem if you regard a low birth rate as bad, as I think I do, if it's that bad. One of the reasons why the birth rate is bad is because this total fertility indicator is very vulnerable to delay in birth rates. Delay of everything, delay in union formation, delay in getting married, if you weren't married at all, delay in having births, delay in dying. These are all fundamental characteristics of modern European demographic development. If you spread out the same number of babies over a larger number of years, you deflate this total fertility rate indicator and make it smaller, even though the final family size may remain the same. What we've got here is a correction, an attempted correction of that effect, looking at the actual total fertility in pale blue and the adjusted one, adjusted for this delay in purple. And as you can see in most countries, that makes the birth rate more respectable and implies that future levels of population aging may not be as bad as one might suppose. We also have interesting divergences in longer lives. I lack the time to go into this fascinating topic in as much detail as I would like. But briefly, we have had remarkable divergences in Europe over the last 50 years or so. You see here the graph upwards of expectation of life at birth. From 1945 to 2010, the lines going in a straight line upwards, pale blue Switzerland, dark blue France, pink the United Kingdom. These are all quite respectable, normal Western developed countries. Below, the graphs showing the decline in expectation of life from 1965, this is the most remarkable, extraordinary development which only exists, or used to exist, in the former communist countries of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. It is called the state socialist mortality syndrome, where death rates of males especially failed to improve, actually got worse. And in the case of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine, as you can see at the bottom on the right, they're still very bad. Those countries which have escaped the communist embrace, the Czech Republic, Poland, and there's another one somewhere there, these are doing, and Hungary, these are doing very much better since 1989. You can see this big change in the graph. They have rejoined the European mainstream. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, in this respect, have not. That just maps these differences. As far as aging is concerned, it's important to realize that this is affecting almost everybody. This is a slightly extreme example. This shows the evolution of Austria's age structure from 1869 on the left to eventually to 2050, evolving from a Christmas tree shape like this one here to through the hideous damage of the 20th century, which you can see great bites taken out of the age structure. Then you see at the bottom in 1971, the beginning of this tiresome baby boom, which has caused confusion and annoyance wherever it's been, moving up the age structure towards 1995, where it gets into middle age. The baby boom seems to have an effect, as far as I can see, on the age structure, rather like a fat python swallowing a goat. The goat in the middle is at the bottom. It's moved up into the middle of the gut, as it were, by 1995. It's moving upwards by 2015, 2030. It's reached old age, making population aging and dependency much worse. Eventually, it will remove itself. And by 2050, you get a much more stable age structure. This is the coffin-shaped, which is typical of those populations with birth rates well below replacement. What about migration? Can migration solve all this? Migration can, and how many minutes? 5. Thank you. Migration can and already does maintain population size in a number of countries. What you see here is a Eurostat's projection to 2055 of selected European countries, showing in blue, pale blue, what they expect the population, how much the population will increase in percent by 2055, compared with, in dark blue, what they expect the population to increase if there were no migration at all. As you can see, Norway, the UK and France all increase somewhat, even without migration, because their birth rates are reasonably robust. Almost all the others decline without migration, certainly Denmark and Finland slightly, the Netherlands quite a bit, Italy a lot, and Germany a great deal. Migration has already preserved population size. Of course, the replacement population are not Germans or Italians, except by adoption. Why are we worried about population aging? The answers are probably reasonably obvious, and I will expand on those tomorrow if anyone happens to go along to Charles University. In brief, they're listed here. The answers are obvious. That the burden of dependency becomes greater. Paying for pensions under a pay-as-you-go system, especially if compensation rates are inflated, becomes more difficult. Labour becomes short, and costs of old age care and social care become more severe. And the lower the birth rate, the more severe these problems are projected to be. This is just a graph showing the relationship between the birth rate measured on the horizontal axis and the support ratio estimated in 2060. Down at the bottom on the left, the countries which are going to have trouble, Japan, South Korea, Poland, Germany, Italy. Up on the top right, the English-speaking world, France, and various others. I'll skip the problems of Taiwan for another day. Can high fertility solve this? Only up to a point. There is no solution to population aging at all. Even replacement level fertility, a family size of 2, would help a great deal, but it would not solve population aging. It would not stop the support ratio deteriorating. Migration also cannot solve population aging. This is the repeated finding of research after research after research, and yet this still comes out as a piece of demographic nonsense. This is the migration, the population size, which you would have to allow migration to generate in England if you maintained the support ratio at 4. That's a ratio of people of nominal working age to the number of people of nominal pension age. At the moment it's 4. To stop population aging, you have to keep it at 4. If you did that, you would need to increase immigration into Britain to up to 5 million immigrants per year. That would increase the population of Britain from 60 million now to 120 million by mid-century to 310 million population by the end of the century and then onwards. You can do a lot with 310 million people. We could invade Iraq all by ourselves, but this would not be a very desirable thing to happen, to multiply our population by 6 times. Important to realize that demography isn't everything in this matter. Population aging, even though inevitable, given a reasonable birth rate, can be managed by all the obvious solutions which will emerge in the course of today's discussion. Increasing retirement age, increasing workforce participation, reducing excessive replacement rates of pensions, improving productivity, reforming pension structure in various different ways, which I believe the Czech Republic is already doing. Migration flows, though, are very high, and very briefly, Madam Chairman, I know my time is very rapidly running out. I will move through these points that I wanted to make the point, first of all, that migration into the Czech Republic is quite at a high level. Czech Republic here net migration is in yellow. It is a similar rate to that of Switzerland in quite recent years, and higher than many other European countries. This, of course, is something new, and something to which the Czech social system, I guess, is not really accustomed to yet. In some countries, migration is at such a high level that the number of immigrants per year in net terms is the same or even bigger than the number of live births in that country. That will quite rapidly replace the population if that continues. The relevant figures are the ones in bold on the right. That's immigrants as a percent of live births to all people in that country. More in Spain, about the same in Switzerland and Italy, rather less in other countries. That presages very rapid ethnic change. In the US, patterns of this kind are projected by the US Bureau of the Census to turn the whitest non-Hispanic population of the US into a minority by about 2042. And almost nothing appears to be likely to change that. Something similar is happening elsewhere in Europe. This is the upward trend of proportion of people of foreign origin in Germany, Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, and Austria. All trending upwards, all heading towards about 25–30%. This is under very conservative assumptions, I ought to say. There is, I think, one interesting thing which is ignored here. That is to say that these ethnic groups, these foreign origin populations, are not likely to remain in their present state because sex and love will help to stop it. These are proportions of unions outside their own group in Britain, high with Caribbean populations and less with Africans. This, perhaps, according to some scientists, is the face of the future. You know the man on the left. The man below is Lewis Hamilton, our #1 motor racing driver. The young lady on the right is a former potential candidate for Miss France, but dismissed for some minor peccadillo. So I can only hope that she will seek asylum in Britain to protect herself from French persecution. In due course, some projections like this one suggest that the populations of mixed origin will be the majority of all minority ethnic groups and will perhaps put ethnic categories into the past, which might be a very welcome development.
my concluding points. Aging inevitable. Major demographic losers in the world, including Europe. Fastest growth in poorest countries is going to present problems for them and probably also for us. I believe that population aging is manageable as long as birth rates are kept reasonably high and as long as wise policies are implemented. Climate change is on a collision with all of this. In the long run, though, we still remain quite ignorant about what will people decide to do about how many children they want, if any, and what will happen to their control over mortality. And I will stop there, Madam Chairman, with apologies for going on too long.